just hit the streaming button. There is no way back. And hold on. I just need to get the confirmation from YouTube. Yes, it seems like we're live. I don't know. Is there maybe your wife, your mom watching?
I have no idea. I told people to take a look, and it could be a friend from high school. It could be someone who's one room over from me right now.
Because I tell you, like, basically my mom doesn't understand English. She doesn't know what I do as a job, but she watches all of the streams. And the only reason why she does that is that my wife said, we're gonna get a kid when you hit 1 million subscribers.
Wow, that is a lofty goal.
That's a big goal, but you know, she should be careful. Yeah, exactly. She should be careful because she doesn't know what the internet is actually capable of.
Yeah, it's like all those things that happen on Twitter. Like, I'll eat an entire chair if I get 5,000 retweets or whatever. So,
I want to get like a lifetime worth of chicken nuggets or something, you know?
Yeah, which, you know, would shorten your life significantly. So it's funny how this can work out.
Yeah. A very short lifetime of chicken nuggets.
Yes.
Okay, so it seems like people are already tuning in. We'll wait a little bit longer. How was your day?
Day's going well. We got some very beautiful weather here in New York City.
Actually, your day just started.
Yeah, right. It's 1 in the afternoon, so yeah.
Okay. It's you know, when I called you this morning, you were of course still at home, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Do you live far from New York?
Yeah, I live a couple hours north of the city. I'm in an area of the Hudson Valley, an area called Garrison, New York. It's right on the Hudson River, so it's a bit of a hike. It's about an hour and 40 minutes to 2 hours each way. And so I tend to come into the city, you know, 3 or 4 times a week and do a little bit of work remotely as well.
Okay, I see. Yeah, you know, it's New York is a beautiful city, but trying to live in the city, it's very expensive, put it this way.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell a quick story. My wife and I lived in Brooklyn for 5 years, and I loved it. You know, we both hail from Vermont. We're one of those weird high school sweetheart couples. And we found ourselves very overwhelmed at first by how enormous the city was. But I was excited by all the opportunities, and with everything happening with architecture and virtual reality, I was really in love with what was possible here. She wanted to go back to Vermont, and so as a compromise, you know, compromise being very important in marriages and relationships, we decided to look for a house that was commuting distance to New York City. Commuting distance, of course, being a very relative term, but still felt like Vermont. And so what we ended up with is this house that's like in the middle of the woods, but like a 10-minute drive to a train station, which can get me to New York City. So it's quite an interesting disconnect going from this concrete jungle here in the city to that where there's like coyotes right outside our house and that kind of thing every night. Yeah.
I just want to ask the guys from you know, watching the video if everything is fine. Is the audio okay? Because usually people that are watching this, they say hi, but this time nobody's saying anything. But I see that there are 15 people online.
Hi, 15 people.
Okay, I guess, look, we're already 3 minutes in. I would say let's not waste any of your precious time.
So precious.
Alex, I'm here with Alex Coulombe. I pronounced that right? Kinda.
Yeah, that was great.
And do you want to give us a little bit of your background, who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. My name is Alex Coulombe. Great pronunciation again. I am the creative director of Agile Immersive Design. We are a consultancy based in New York City that creates virtual reality content, workflows, very custom solutions, particularly tailored towards the AEC, architecture, engineering, construction industry. And we're also finding lately that we're getting pulled more and more into real estate. And this has been going for about a year. You know, we had kind of a soft opening a year ago with a couple clients, and then officially started in July. And it's been a ton of fun. I've been working in virtual reality since the Oculus Rift DK1. We got ours in late 2013. And it was really cool to transition from that being a very passionate hobby to something I can do full time now.
I see. Can you tell me a little bit, because I know that you have studied architecture, if I'm correct, right?
That's right. Yeah.
How did you go into virtual reality? What was the steps that you took? What were the steps?
It's a great question, and it's a fun thing about this industry. Of course, virtual reality has existed since the 80s, but most of the people that I interact with who are doing something similar to me with virtual reality right now, they were doing something totally different 5 or 10 years ago. And so for me, I've always been interested in emerging technology. And so in architecture school, I went to school at Syracuse University in upstate New York. I was always looking for a way for technology to help design, to make design more intuitive and more, I want to say, I wanted everyone to feel more confident about the designs they were making and also how they were communicating them. And part of that came from the fact that I realized halfway into my first year of architecture school that I wasn't a great hand drafter. I can sketch really well, but when it came to like clean, nice lines, everything would get smudgy and my study models would get glue on them. And so I needed some kind of way to express these great ideas I had in my head. And so, I really dove hard into computers. We weren't allowed to touch computers for the first year of architecture school, but then starting in second year, I was allowed to use Rhino and 3ds Max and some of these programs, and was like, oh, thank God, I don't have to drop out. I'm actually good at this part. And so from there on, I was looking at, plugins and rendering and how to create, real-time visualizations. There was a program called, I think it was called Quest 3D back in the day that I was using that was like node-based and very complex. And I was creating these, real-time walkthroughs of my designs with that. And then by the time we got to my thesis year in 2009 and 2010, there was some interesting augmented reality stuff happening. And so I was playing with that. My thesis was taking Fort J, which is on Governor's Island, a little bit south of New York City here, and using the kind of natural sightline qualities of it. It's the star-shaped fort that was meant to, fight off the British during the War of 1812. And I inverted some of the sightline elements of that and turned it into this crazy theater that had like a panopticon quality where the audience would be in the middle and they'd look around. It was crazy and would have cost like $12 billion to build. But I was using augmented reality as far back as there, both to show the complexity of the model that I'd made, but then also to give a sense of the audience experience, because the idea was that you could never see all the different stages at once. So you'd have maybe 3 stages you could be viewing just by tilting your head, and then you'd have basically a camera you could be controlling behind you that would also allow you to have this second screen experience to see the other stages. So very much like a spectacle overload sort of thing. And so I was excited by that technology and was kind of sad that once I started working at architecture firms after graduation, that there wasn't a lot of interest or opportunity in that. So I was like, oh, okay, I'll be the Revit guy. Like, I've always been interested in the latest software. So inevitably I found myself being like the guy who knows the latest software and trying to teach that to the firms I was working for. And then I found myself at Fisher Dax Associates, which is a theater planning and design consultancy. So basically the idea being that it's like architects, but without the liability of architects. So Fisher Dax Associates specializes in designing theaters all over the world, small little studio theaters to giant opera houses in China. And that was a really good fit for me, because one thing I didn't like about traditional architecture firms was it seemed to me there was a very high level of bureaucracy and administration. There's a lot of just emails and what almost feels like babysitting, where you're just trying to coordinate 1,000 different things coming into you. And it didn't feel as creative as school did, which, I expected, but it was kind of draining, even though I was working for some really lovely firms. And what I found at Fisher Dax Associates was, being a consultancy, there's less of that. It's more pure creativity and more design. And as you can tell from my thesis, I was really fascinated by theaters and that kind of typology. And I had a theater group that I ran in college. So the performance side has also been very, very fascinating to me. I don't know if you can tell, I'm very animated, and theater is very exciting to me.
That would have been one of the next questions.
Yeah, right. Have you ever done that before? Yeah. So then at Fisher Dax Associates, a big part of the job when we were designing theaters was checking sightlines, for example. So we'd take all these renderings of the different seat views in, balcony 2, row Q, seat 13. And we'd be showing those renderings to people to try to communicate what the view was like to the stage. And so immediately when the Oculus Rift DK1 came out, that seemed to me to be a huge opportunity to be like, oh my God, we can put people in the seats, because, a lot of people can't read plans, a lot of people can't read sections, but even renderings don't always communicate what you need them to, because it lacks that spatial element to it. So we might be showing a rendering of a seat view to someone, and they'd look at it and go, stage looks really far away. And you'd be like, no, it's 40 feet away. Like, you tell them that's a normal distance, don't worry about it. Or they'd be like, the head of the seat in front looks really close. That's going to be uncomfortable. And you'd be like, no, the row depth is 3 feet. Like, that's a standard row depth. That's what we do in most theaters. And so you'd find yourself having these conversations where it's like, you know that they have nothing to be worried about, but you can't really prove it. And so immediately the utility we saw for virtual reality was cutting down on those conversations. We could just put someone in the seat, and they could look around, and they could feel, they'd have a sense of presence about where that head was and how far away the stage was. And we found that our meetings and our conversations just became so much more productive, because it wasn't about these things that we knew, like, we just needed to convince them of. They could convince themselves. Instead, it became about the design and the aesthetics and the spatial experience. And then it could be like, hey, this railing actually feels a little bit too close or too far away. And we could discuss more about how the space felt, which was something that wasn't really possible before. And so one thing led to another, and I was excited by all the uses of VR in theater. But then that led to, I did a bunch of freelance work, did a cool thing with Bravo Media for the Late Show with Stephen Colbert. I worked with Equinox, which is a popular gym here in New York City.
I know it.
Yeah, oh, cool. That's hilarious. Are they abroad? Are they international?
No, but I've been there because, it's a long story. It's about you tonight. I'll tell you my story another time.
I can't wait to hear it. But yeah, so I was doing all these freelance projects, just kind of expanding the possibilities of VR, and I was getting really excited about how VR could be used as an active design tool that could actually help people make better design decisions faster and just solve problems in a way that wasn't possible before that. So those were the kinds of assignments I was looking for. And it got to a point where I still loved being an architect, theater designer kind of person, but I was so in love with the rapid pace that the technology was changing with virtual reality and the opportunities there to really kind of be blazing a trail, to be on the cutting edge of all this. And so it reached a point where my former boss, Joshua Dax of Fisher Dax Associates, approached me and said, hey, why don't we actually turn this into a separate company where we can really focus on this, because it seems like there's a lot of desire for this. And even at Fisher Dax Associates, which was only doing theaters, we'd have architects we were working with come to us and say, hey, we're doing like a hospital or a museum. It's not a theater, but can you do something similar to what you guys have been doing with theaters? And so we'd end up doing those kind of on the side. So it just reached that point where it didn't make sense for me to be doing 80 hours of freelance work, and it didn't make sense to be bringing some of this into Fisher Dax. So thus was born Agile Lens as a catch-all for this virtual reality, custom work, basically.
I apologize. Maybe now we're gonna, go back a little bit in time. But I'm very interested in one aspect of the things that you said. Everything is interesting, but I found myself in the probably same position. In 2010, I created with a friend of mine one of the very first applications known in the industry for architectural visualization. And that was the case because the plugin that we were using was the first plugin that was created by the company Qualcomm,
Yeah.
And we were working together with them because they have an office in Vienna, and a friend of mine was in touch with them, and I think he also ended up working for them. I don't remember. But it was basically a showcase in augmented reality by using a tablet or a phone. And, we had to use a specific type of phone because we needed, a specific type of processor to run that kind of a tracking algorithm. And I remember that the biggest issue that we had in presenting our project was the fact that our teachers completely rejected the idea of having that media for communicating with clients, with architects, with other colleagues. And that seemed to me a very a big obstacle already in the past, that we were not able to train the older generation of designers to kind of digest this new media. And, hearing that you were able since the very beginning to implement this into your design process, to me it's very fascinating. Can you provide me a little bit more context regarding this aspect, if you can? Otherwise, we will move to the next question. Don't worry.
Yeah, you mean specifically like in school and the education side?
Yeah, like, and even when you finished after school, how was for you the process of like showing this technology to people and say, guys, that's how we're gonna move on from now on,
Yeah, it's a great question, and it definitely started in school. Actually, my first instance with something like this actually came with the theater group that I mentioned that I started, because the semester where my friends and I started this theater group, it was meant to be an outlet for architects. We were trying to find a way to, take a break from just thinking about Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and these kinds of guys, and to just do something that was fun and another creative outlet, and we could use our architecture skills for set design, and I've always been into playwriting. And what we found very quickly was there was a lot of the old guard, these older professors, who were like, no, if you're going to be an architect, you should only be looking at architecture and like in the narrowest vision of that, like only be looking at famous architects from pre-1980 or something like that. And it was just such a narrow way of viewing the world. And I understood there was a certain perspective there in building up an expertise within that frame. And maybe as a student, the narrower your focus is, the more specialized and knowledgeable you can become about that. But what started with the theater group was this understanding that if you can go outside of your comfort zone and outside of the traditional ways to design and follow these creative paths, there's a lot of opportunities that spring up. And I'll give one example, which was that in this theater group, I was writing a show, actually 10 years ago, almost to the day, that had a kind of an unfamiliar structure. Or just something I was playing with that I thought could be fun. And in the broadest terms to talk about it, the structure of the play ended up affecting the structure of the architecture project I was working on that semester. And so the way these kinds of different disciplines can stretch your brain was really exciting to me. And at Syracuse, they actually ended up, I think it was just kind of an experimental thing, but they did a couple charrettes, these competitions that they called like interdisciplinary collaboration events. And so they get people from, the theater department and landscape architecture and industrial design and interior design and architecture, and we'd all get put in a room together to try to solve a problem. And I loved seeing all these different perspectives people were coming at from that stuff. And all that leads up to is I was lucky to have experiences like that. And then like two professors in particular, I'll call out Brian Lonsway and John Yoder at Syracuse University, who were very open to new kinds of representation and ways to design. And, in Brian Lonsway's class, for example, I had a semester where not only was I creating an interactive model, but it was like a configurable modular thing. It was we were building restaurants going through this whole slow food movement where you needed to be able to grow all the food on site for the restaurant. Okay. And my partner and I were doing this thing with shipping containers, and we thought, we can specify like here's how the restaurant should be, but we thought it would be much more interesting to create a system. And so at this time we were using a piece of software called Experience, and basically created this interactive configurable restaurant builder where you'd start with a shipping container and then you could start to add different kinds of features that we pre-configured. And it was kind of based on the franchise model of places like Subway and McDonald's and Wendy's, where like there's a little bit of room for changing up the formula, but there's guidelines and parameters. And so with that kind of structure and that confidence that like, okay, within school we see that there are people that are willing to recognize that there's use in this. Going outside of school, as I mentioned, these first few architecture firms, it was really a struggle. I would do these proofs of concepts on my own time. I'd bring them into the office and I'd say, isn't this exciting? And maybe I'd get like that's kind of cool. But the thing everyone would fall back to is like, but that's not what we do. Yeah. And so it almost became like a brand identity sort of thing. And architects are so busy all the time. And I'm finding this now with Agile Lens as well, because we're trying to show as many architects as possible how to incorporate some of these other workflows into their office. And architects are exhausted. They've already gone from hand drafting to CAD to BIM, Revit, and these other programs in like a relatively short amount of time. You figure like pre-1980, everything was still hand drawing. And then with the rate of technology changing, architects are being asked to learn all these new workflows and everything so quickly. So there is just a little bit of fatigue there where as soon as you're like, oh guys, I can show you something you can do in virtual reality that's going to cut your design time in half and it's going to save you a bunch of money. And they're like, don't show us something new. And that's definitely a struggle. So the success has come in the instances where I've been able to be directly involved with the project and actually, whether through permission or not, just start to do certain things that I can then say, hey guys, isn't this better than the way we used to do it? It's much harder to do that as an outsider, unless you're going to do a lot of hard work pro bono, which I've done a couple times. But as a designer at Fisher Dax in particular, I've been able to build up these case studies of projects where it's like, this is very similar to a project that was done 5 years ago, and here's all these decisions that got made way faster. Look at how tighter the budget is. And then when you get to the construction side, you can talk about the reduction in change orders. There's less, second guessing something after construction has started because so many people at that point have seen the design in VR and have more confidence about it. And there's less of like, oh my God, why is the ceiling like this? This is terrible, which can happen if everyone's just looking at plans and sections. And, maybe there was never a rendering that showed that particular aspect of the building. So, yeah.
That's a very good point. Hold on. Let me just talk to the audience because, I see there are 20 people watching, 22 now. If guys, if you have any questions or if you're just tuning in, please do write. I'm gonna keep an eye on the chat, and if I see some questions coming up, I'll try to interrupt you, Alex. But you're a train, man. I really like.
I know.
But it's
I'm sorry
good.
You have to deal with it.
No, it's good. It's great. It's absolutely fantastic, and I'm gonna say thank you to Jeff later. Oh, there is somebody from New York City. Somebody from Argentina. Good. Okay, so we'll see a lot of people tuning in. Now, there is a question that I want to ask you myself, and it's a personal question, and I'm gonna take all the responsibility for asking you this question. I've been very involved in the teaching, okay? And I was hired to teach Rhino because I'm myself a Rhino instructor, and then I became a Cinema 4D and V-Ray instructor, blah, blah, blah. And one of the ideas that I was always pushing was, I'll tell you later from who was inspired, to really use 3D as a research and development tool and not as a representation tool. Now, the problem very often is that when you communicate with architects, especially in the university, teachers that maybe are 15, 20 years older than you, they'll tell you that this is wrong because, there are some rules that apply to architecture in terms of like proportions and how you should design a building, plans, section. You develop a plan and then you study the section. And, probably I didn't study that side of architecture good enough, but I also see that with 3D we have a way to test designs much faster and to test proportions in a real 3D world environment much faster and with a better visual feedback. Now, I did not go too much into VR whilst I was teaching because I stopped a year ago more or less. But now I see this VR coming, even in the universities, and teachers are pushing that. It seems to me that it's silly that we still have to respect the old ways of designing buildings, because now these tools, they allow us a interactive feedback loop. We don't have to work on sections and plans. We can do this in real time in 3D. What is your take on this? Because sometimes I get really frustrated when people say, yeah, the plan, the section, and I'm like, really? Still? We're gonna get shit, both of us. So be careful.
I know it's a great question, and like I had some friends in architecture school who were fantastic designers, and they would abide by these formal principles, golden ratios, and their plans and sections would look gorgeous. Although, I'll say I never got to experience their designs in a physical way, and I've been to I shouldn't even bother saying that I've been to classically designed buildings that are absolutely gorgeous to be inside of, and I think there is a lot to say for the Beaux-Arts tradition and some of these techniques that have been built up over centuries. But I think it's wrong to ignore the new tools and the new affordances and the way we can build off that. I'll say this: there are people that, for example, with Revit, they jumped right over to Revit, weren't thinking about any of these principles, and would start making designs where they were looking at the 3D side. And what it really is, it's like a forest for the trees sort of thing. So they're zoomed out, and at the macro level, everything looks good. But because they aren't looking closely at the sections and the plans and giving it all the detail that you would be if you were hand drafting or even in CAD doing all of these different elements one by one, they aren't really grasping their design at a level that you would be if you're forced to do all of that. Because in Revit, of course, you're making the 3D building, you're not drawing lines, you're drawing walls, and you're not drawing 3 lines to represent a door. You're actually placing a door inside a wall. You're building 3-dimensionally, which in some ways is great. Reminds me of playing with The Sims when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But yeah, because the act of taking a section is no longer saying, okay, here's where I'm going to take the section, and now I'm going to line up the plan here and line up the elevation here and draw everything, and then discover as I'm doing that, like, oh yeah, this wall really doesn't make sense here, or something like that. Instead, in Revit, it's a byproduct. You make it in 3D, and then you say, okay, we're cutting here, and that's the section, and there often is less consideration there. So I do think there's a lot of people, especially in a high pressure office environment, where what has happened, and in my experience, especially with the traditional architecture firms I've worked at, is everyone has had this understanding that the better technology gets, the lower fees should get, and the faster design should happen.
No.
And so I know it's ridiculous. Like what should have happened is a certain amount of technology frustration should have been reduced to the point where you have more time to focus on design and can refine these buildings better. But I think the opposite has happened. The technology has given the clients and the owners and the people funding these projects a false sense of how fast this can happen, and that's it. Like with a BIM model, in theory, you can create construction documents a lot faster than you could before, but it's not given the same level of consideration. So I think that's a really difficult thing. So I do think in many ways virtual reality and augmented reality and all these different new immersive technology solutions can start to serve as a mitigator or something that can help fill in some of the holes of what happens when you're building this 3D BIM model so quickly and never really get a chance to pay it due consideration. Something that happens immediately when someone goes into VR, whether it's purely for visualization or if there's some interactive design elements, is they enter this kind of mindset where they are thinking like a designer. And I've been in walkthroughs with architects and other people who I've worked with on a project after it's ready to open or in the middle of construction. And there's always those moments where everyone's looking around going like, I wish we had changed that. Because you're seeing it for the first time that way. And that happens again more and more with something like Revit, where a lot of those decisions are byproducts, where you're like, I was so focused on this room over here that I never really paid attention to how much it was affecting this room over here. And if you're walking around in the VR model, you are seeing these things. And then hopefully that leads to better design decisions. Does that kind of answer your question?
No, of course, absolutely. The thing is that, I don't want people to make the mistake thinking that I'm saying that you shouldn't know the classical principles of architecture. I'm just saying that now we have the tools that we can use to facilitate the process and make it a lot faster. But as you were saying, which is an incredibly good point, is that this doesn't mean that designs should be cheaper. I think that this is the consequence of like software companies making marketing, and trying to make people believe that things can get easier and faster and cheaper. I think that actually there should have been a lot more honesty from that side as well. And the only goal here is to make things better. I think that, VR in design has the biggest role is to make design better. Because, when it comes to the marketing, then, if you, before with renderings, you were trying to hide things, now you can see everything. So you need to make better designs. And I think the VR, this should be the main goal. And I think it is. I don't know, because I've never used it in production. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more. But anyway, before we continue, there are some questions that are coming in. I'm going to ask them to you first. You can answer them, and then we can continue this conversation. So,
cool.
First one, what software are you using?
Okay, that can be a quick one. Down the pipeline, AutoCAD, SketchUp, Revit, Rhino, 3ds Max, all the Adobe suite, After Effects, Photoshop, all those things, which are starting to get more VR features. And then on the more specifically VR side, I'm partnered with a lot of companies, so I'm testing, beta versions of their software. And Visor, Insight VR, Iris VR, Modelo, Immersify. When I'm building really custom things, I'm using Unity, Unreal. I'm doing some stuff with Autodesk 3ds Max Interactive. I'm probably missing a couple, but that's the ones that come to head immediately.
That's a mouthful of software.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any link or business interaction with the video game industry?
Yeah, the link. So this is a part of my history, I guess we kind of skipped over, but going from pure architect to someone who could work with virtual reality, there was a little bit of a learning curve there. And I think, a lot of architecture firms were excited by the potential of the Oculus Rift DK1. Tons of them ordered them. And I think actually the panel I was on with Jeff Model at Autodesk University last year, which is available for streaming if anyone wants to check it out. Jeff threw up these statistics of just how many Oculus Rifts had been purchased, but then so few of them actually got used because people were like, oh, it's not plug and play. We can't just have this one-click solution for being in VR, which came later. But people were like, no, too intimidating. We don't have time. We don't have the resources. And they just sat there gathering dust. And so, yeah, I was obviously very excited about this and would have foregone sleep for the next 6 months to make this work. And so I had to teach myself Unity and then later Unreal and how to code and all these things that I wasn't familiar with. And so the biggest jumps in learning for that happened for me going to hackathons and game jams. Global Game Jam is a big one that maybe you know about that happens all over the world. And so, it's been really fun thinking about how Global Game Jam, to use one example, has progressed for me, because the first year I did it, I made a board game, because I have a little bit of a history with game design with board games, which came from using the extra pieces of my architecture models, because I don't like to throw things away that are beautifully precision cut by lasers. And then, so it was taking, general game design principles. Okay, hackathon, not doing any coding, but let's make a board game. The next year, I was working with some people who were a little more familiar with Unity, and I could help out a little bit more with the game design. And I learned a little bit about C# and JavaScript and how to get my 3D models that I might have had from a Revit or an architecture file into these game environments. Then I started to learn more about optimization and all the other things that need to be done to a model to make it work in a game environment. And then each progressive year with Global Game Jam, I've been able to play a bigger and bigger role in every aspect of the game design, where I'm at the point where I know enough about the entire pipeline that I can create games. And I'll give you one example of how this kind of thing is translated to architecture. So a few years ago, my team and I, we made a game called Tiger 9 for Global Game Jam, where the theme was, what do we do now? And so the setup of this particular game was, you're in a spaceship and you're with all these other spaceships and you're flying through and you're excited to go off to battle and you're talking about these aliens that have destroyed your families and your homeland, and it's getting you psyched up for this big space battle. And then everyone has their war cry and they blast off into hyperspace, and then your ship just stalls and shuts down. And there you go. So there's the premise of what do we do now? And it ends up being a puzzle game where on the radio you're hearing about this epic battle happening while you're just floating in the dark of space, with your ship falling apart and you're trying to fix it. And as part of that, a piece of script that we had to code was this idea that you have all these buttons in your ship. And this is before Oculus, hand controllers, Vive hand controllers, anything like that. We actually made this for Google Cardboard. And the idea was that we needed to let you press the buttons. And so we needed to have a way to look at a button and then have it highlight and then tap the screen to click it, or to use the Google Cardboard magnet clicker. And so the script I ended up writing for that, it shot out this ray and it made something glow. When I got back to my office after 3 days of not sleeping, making that game, I was like, oh, wait a minute. What we're trying to do, of course, is do sightlines for theaters at this time, and I could actually use that same code to make this work in architecture. I can look at a seat, cast this ray, have that seat glow, and then when you click, you'll jump to that seat view. Because before that, I had made these like pre-scripted things where it was basically a 3ds Max animation where it was just jumping you in, order across 20 different seats. Yeah, so the game design element has been really cool. Just going back to that, the importance of interdisciplinary design, I've learned so many lessons from board game design and video game design that have translated now into the work I'm doing at these more enterprise level solutions.
There are, by the way, Jeff just tuned in. He has a question. We'll get to it. We have with us also Arya, which is the guy in charge for the Unreal community here in Israel, where I'm currently at. So, there is a lot of cool people listening to this. So I'm pretty sure that that we're going to have a very good feedback about this chat. I want to ask you, 3DNOB is asking, or 3DNOB, I think it's the name, sorry. My question is, VR is a personal experience. How do we sell its relevance to a wide audience, such as the real estate group?
Yeah, I'm guessing by personal experience, they mean that it's something that you kind of have to get someone inside of a headset to see. And I think part of that comes from having a wide variety of tactics, and that's where something like augmented reality can come in really handy. I've definitely found myself speaking to architecture firms, for example, and actually real estate people as well, that do just shy away from the idea of even putting on a VR headset. And you can sit there being like, no, just put it on, give it a try, it's going to be great, please, 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 and they still won't do it. And so it's good to have backup systems like augmented reality, which not only have a lot of great uses in their own right, being able to show someone a 3D model of a building or have them walk through it, or in some cases actually walk through the site of a building and see the digital overlays of what's going to be there. That can also serve as a gateway. That can be something where if someone is convinced by what they can see on their iPad, maybe at that point they're like, okay, I'll put on the headset and see how it looks. And then, you get people past that extra step. But on the real estate side, I mean, from my personal experience, there's a lot of data out there now that you can quote about how much virtual reality has been able to help with sales. And, as a personal example, I can say, like, when my wife and I bought our house a few years ago, coming from New York City and taking these 2-hour drives every weekend in a zip car were exhausting. And we were doing these house searches for 6 months. And we were looking at Zillow and these different sites where we could see pictures and photos and everything of the houses. And we'd be like, that house looks great, let's go check it out. And we'd get there. And the moment we were inside, we'd be like, oh, no, another weekend wasted. And so virtual reality had been more prevalent at the time, especially in the real estate industry. We could have gone through 90% of the houses that we spent all this time and money going to see and just looked around at a 360 image and been like, oh, yeah, no, not this one. And so what's interesting for what I'm doing now with real estate is I'm primarily working on speculative real estate. Or not speculative, projects that aren't built yet, basically. Mm-hmm. And that basically came about because the virtual reality work I do with architecture spans from the very earliest phases of design, where there's just sketches going on, and then through all these intermediate levels where you're building out these massing models and refining and iterating. And then at the end of that, of course, is you might want to have something that's very photoreal and going to give people a good sense of what the finished project is going to look like. So at that point, it actually is very much something that the real estate industry is interested in, because say you're done with a design and the design isn't going to be built for 2 or 3 years, if you can make a photoreal, really beautiful narrative experience of taking people through this project, and there's, say it's a residential building, you can pre-sell units. You can sell units to people years before the building is constructed. And I've done that with a couple companies now that they've had. One company down in North Carolina said that their pre-selling rate was at like 340% of what it was for the last similar project they did. And there's a lot of data like that you can find out there. Yeah, and so, there's personal anecdotes you can tell like that, but I mean, I'd say find the data. If you need to convince people of the power of this, find those kinds of statistics, and then as much as possible, try to get someone into the technology, either putting on a headset or some of the lighter fare that they can look at without potentially embarrassing themselves. That is the hardest thing about virtual reality, is everyone's afraid that once they have the headset on, people are going to be pointing and laughing at them.
But
so,
you know,
we gotta get past that.
A couple of weeks ago, I was listening to some videos on YouTube. I watch so much stuff that sometimes I forget who said it. But somebody, a big CEO, I really need to remember, said that, you know, he sees the future of like mobile phones as being, you know, glasses. So, you know, mobile phones will actually be glasses, and we are going to be more integrated with, like, you know, a potential virtual reality as, you know, now. Because now if we want to do something, we need to actually change the perspective of the way we use the phone to make it, you know, glasses. Instead, if we are going to have glasses, they're going to become part of like our daily gear. You know, I'm ready to go out and fight. So, you know, a couple of years ago, I was at a 3D printing actually event, but there was also talk about the future of virtual reality. And there was a talk from a professor somewhere in northern England that was very interesting, because he said, you know, soon we are going to have situations where virtual reality will be, you know, given to kids, and kids will play with it, and, you know, the parents will pick it up, and we will have like augmented reality children books. And we're talking about, you know, 2012, and then this of course became a reality. So I remain positive, at least, you know, from that side of things, that soon we're gonna get, you know, people to be like, okay, I'm putting on the glasses. You know, they will be more prone to do that. Anyway, there is a question from Jeff. Have you have you seen any sort of transition between where XR is being used, V's versus design? Early adopters seem to have found most benefit on the design side. Has this changed much in the last few years?
In the last few years, well, yeah, I mean, because back, you know, a few years ago, I don't think anyone was really using any of this stuff on the design side, unless you were working for NASA or some company that really had the ability to pay for what the stuff used to cost, you know, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'll say it's been a little bit of a struggle. Like a big section of the presentations I give these days are trying to show people how it's really not as intimidating as they think to start using different VR and AR, and to use the XR term, any of these different kinds of technologies, as something that they actually can use in their design process. You know, I know some really talented draftsmen, sketchers, all these people that are still familiar with these more traditional mediums, and, you know, some of them are so good at what they do by hand that they've actually been able to avoid transitioning to computers at all. They never learned CAD, they never learned Revit, and some of them are artists, and some of them are actually still doing like hand drawings of planes and sections. And especially for those people that I know are so talented in that way, it's this personal goal of mine to get as many of them as possible drawing inside something like virtual reality, for example, because it's not as intimidating as they think it is. You know, programs like Tilt Brush are so intuitive to just jump into, and then there's some like Gravity Sketch, and I met with a startup here in New York City on Friday that has a really promising new piece of software called Moment, which is very much intended for architects to actually be able to design with. Sketchbox is another good one. And these programs really, if you already are an excellent artist, draftsman, you know, have some sense of how to do this stuff in 2D, it's not very difficult to actually jump into doing it in a 3D way. And I think there's this misconception that, you know, well, I'm going to be exhausted. It's going to be so tiring to draw so much in there. And in most cases, like, I do a ton of drawing in virtual reality now, and modeling as well, and I'm usually not in there for more than 30 to 40 minutes. And that's not just because it's exhausting, but it's because after doing this enough, you learn an economy of time and effort. You learn what actually needs to be done. You don't need to draw every single line or model every single piece of something. You work through whatever you're having difficulty grasping, where 2D isn't quite enough for you at that moment. And, you know, a few really beautifully conceived and drawn lines in VR can tell a great story for the direction that a piece of architecture is going to go, without limiting people in the way that something that more photorealistic might. You know, I've made the mistake before of getting too much photorealism too quickly in a VR model, and then maybe we're supposed to be talking about one element of the design, like to use the theater example, something like acoustic panels. And then instead what's ended up happening is everyone's focusing on like, is that really going to be wood? Is that really where that light's going to be? And so done well, a sketch, for example, can still leave a lot up to the imagination. You know, VR can overwhelm the senses sometimes and can show people more than the audience is actually ready for. And so, yeah, I keep going back to the sketching thing because that's an opportunity where you can give a sense of progression of going from a compressed space to a larger space to highlight some really, you know, wonderful details of a design at a certain point while still leaving a lot up to the imagination and for people to project what they want to see in the future. So I'm going in a lot of different directions here, but I think to succinctly answer Jeff's question, yes, this stuff is being used more from the design side, but I want to see it happening faster, and I'm still trying to find ways to get people over the hump of being convinced that there's a huge learning curve to this all, which in many cases there is not.
Jeff made also a point, you know, he wanted to... Jeff, you got the answer. It's I think it was clear what he was asking. Snacky is asking if you have had any experience with the Microsoft HoloLens, but there is also another question that I'm not really sure what it's meant to be. How far from now is real-time VR like Unreal or Unity?
Whoever asked that, I'd ask for a little more clarification. Because right now we can get real-time VR in Unity and Unreal, even to the point where fairly recently there's just a VR button now in these programs where you can have any kind of model, and whether you've been thinking about it for VR or not, you can put on a headset and at least look around, which is pretty cool.
Okay.
What was the first question again? Sorry.
If you had any experience with the Microsoft HoloLens.
Yeah, to be honest, I wasn't super impressed by it. I got to see some demos with it right away. For me, the field of view was too narrow. It was too expensive for me to recommend it to many of my clients. It just felt like there was more that could be done with that. And I was looking forward to watching the price of the technology drop, for the technology to get better. It still costs, you know, while companies like Oculus and Vive have continued to drop the prices of their VR headsets. If you want to buy a HoloLens today, it's still $3,000. And I think that we're going to see a lot more happen in the HoloLens-esque space with Magic Leap, and then also, which, you know, may or may not be vaporware. I could go into a very long discussion right now about whether or not Magic Leap is actually going to be able to deliver on all of its promises. But something that's really exciting that people can do right now, which is in that same realm of mixed reality with the HoloLens and Magic Leap, is with the Vive Pro. If anyone has a Vive Pro or is thinking of getting one, you have 2 cameras on the front, and that actually allows you to basically have a Magic Leap development kit with a wider field of view. They say the field of view for Magic Leap, it'll be a little bit better than HoloLens. It's like a VHS tape held out at half an arm's length. And with the Vive Pro, you can actually see your entire environment stereoscopically. It's pretty low resolution, but it allows you to start to add these digital elements into your environment that are interacting with the real world. And that's kind of a new frontier of how do we design games, experiences, enterprise solutions in a way to really take advantage of that. Because the HoloLens can do that to a certain extent, but the processing power is limited. The amount of spatial data about the environment you're in at the moment is pretty limited. So I think for all intents and purposes, right now that stuff is still very much at a dev kit level. I still think it's that like how VR was with the Oculus Rift DK1 or DK2. But I think very soon we're going to see an explosion of the capabilities of that, both at a lower price point and then as well just in terms of what can actually be done. I'm excited about things like walking through an entire building that's under construction and literally being able to see the entire building digitally from a Magic Leap, or I guess maybe a Vive Pro if you have a backpack on or something like that. So that's all exciting.
Okay, so there are some more questions coming. Federico is trying to give us a little bit more information about the first question he asked. I meant, how far is that technology applied to common projects without extra effort in baking maps, rebuilding stuff in a real, etc.? And hold on, let me just ask everything so you know that we can move on. Arya is also asking for a private meeting. Later I'm gonna I'm gonna put a link to your social media so that if people want to get in touch with you, I guess they can, right?
Yeah, and real quick, I'll just say on all these different channels, I'm Ibrews, Ibrews. Think of eyebrows. Should be a good mnemonic device. And yeah, continue.
Also, Jeff says, sources tell me Magic Leap seems likely to come to the market at the same price range as the HoloLens. Do you think this will limit its use in architecture then, presuming the hype lives up to reality? It's still very expensive then.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding was Magic Leap is going to have a couple different tiers. Like, I'd be surprised if the lowest cost version of it is still at HoloLens pricing. I got the impression the lowest price one will still be somewhere in like the $1,200 range, but maybe that's not right. Spoiler alert, I might actually get to be visiting the Magic Leap offices sometime in the next couple months. So without being murdered by NDA SWAT assassins, maybe I'll have more thoughts on that. But I also think that Magic Leap, the fact that they're combining all these different gesture inputs, the controller, along with gestures and some of these other elements is exciting. And then, of course, I didn't even mention what Keiichi Matsuda and everyone at Leap Motion is doing now, where they're saying for $150, you know, they'll be able to release this dev kit that has a 180-degree field of view, which is also in that realm. So, you know, even if Magic Leap turns out to be a little bit of whatever, over-promising on what it can do and the price point is too high, maybe Leap Motion ends up taking up the mantle of the potential of that. And then the other question about VR in, just one-click solutions. I mean, what that makes me think of is in Unreal Engine, a few releases back, they released the VR editor, which I absolutely love and use all the time. And for anyone who doesn't know, you can be in a project where VR isn't the end goal. It could be just something that you're building, and it's just going to be an animation, or it's going to be a rendering or something like that. And in the VR editor, without doing any kind of optimization, you can click on it, and I don't know how it does this so well, but I've had incredibly heavy models with millions of polygons and complex textures and complex shaders and 300 real-time lights actually run pretty smoothly, where in the VR editor you can scale up, you can scale down. It almost starts to treat it like a tilt brush file or something like that, where you can play with the scale, you can move stuff around. You can't draw inside the VR editor, but I typically am bringing stuff over from drawing programs if I'm inside there. You can move lights around, you can change a bunch of different settings. And I find that to be a really excellent way to work. And now, we haven't talked much about what I'm doing these days with theater, but I'm working more with companies that want to use VR for production design. And so this isn't even for theater, immersive theater experiences or theater that is going to have a VR element at the end, but there's something really powerful about being able to put someone inside a VR headset and move the set around, or talk about how the actors are going to be blocked around the stage, or change the light cues. So you can start to just visualize real world things that aren't going to have a VR output in VR, and that can be really exciting. Steven Spielberg, of course, has been talking a lot about using VR in making Ready Player One, but of course, you know, this stuff makes me think back to as far back as Avatar with James Cameron 10 years ago, like he was doing, and even actually Lord of the Rings, so even further back than that, there were ways, of course, to have these kinds of virtual reality ways to place a camera and move through a digital environment to help the actors and the director understand everything better. So to put that in a shorter way, yeah, there's a lot of fantastic ways to use VR, even if VR isn't the final output, and I encourage everyone to be exploring those.
This sounds so exciting. There is a question from Ariem. How do you deal with the lack of VR-ready computers in the office of clients? How many deals fall apart because of hardware problems?
For me, that hasn't happened directly. I think it's probably happened to some of my clients who thought that they didn't need my help for a big presentation, and then they ran into some technical issues. Unfortunately, that is still something that happens, where, like, for some reason, Steam VR will not read the fact that you have a headset plugged in or something like that. And so those little hiccups can certainly cause problems. I'll say the opposite has happened, though, where I have one client where they sent me an HP ZBook 2. It's like a tablet, pretty expensive tablet, but it's basically a laptop that they want to be able to take on site, and it's got a whole Wacom touch experience for drawing and all that. And they were saying, hey, what can we do with this beyond looking at our Revit models and marking stuff up in Modelo and the Autodesk viewer? And I actually found that this laptop, which, again, very skinny little tablet, you can basically hold it under one arm, it just weighs a couple pounds, is actually compatible with Windows Mixed Reality. It gives you a little warning that, like, the graphics card isn't optimized for it, but people like to crap on Windows mixed reality headsets. First of all, because they should be called Windows virtual reality, but also because they're cheaper. They don't have as good build quality. They're opening up these platforms to all different Windows devices. But to me, it's really remarkable because something like this, a machine running Windows, already has this mixed reality portal built into it, and I was able to plug in a Windows mixed reality headset and basically have world scale VR walking around, drawing stuff, Immersify, this new one-click solution. Actually, you can bring Revit models, and this little tablet is able to view these 2.5 million polygon Revit models in pretty good frame rate. So yeah, not to dodge the question, but like I've seen more often than having a deal or something fall apart from the technology not working, I've been more excited, and more often what's happened is there have been these opportunities that have popped up where it's like, oh, the technology can actually work or behave in this way that I wasn't expecting it to, because the software has gotten better, the devices have gotten better, the SDKs have gotten better, which is really kind of exciting. But with all that being said, yeah, I do want to encourage people, especially if you're trying to convince your boss or a client or someone of the power of these technologies, don't oversell it. Like, be very realistic about the current limitations. You can talk with very high praise about the direction this is all going and where it'll all be in a couple years, but make sure people know that there are still some growing pains and some hiccups, and things can crash and explode spontaneously.
Manage your client expectations. That's the rule number one.
Yes. Don't overpromise.
Exactly. Alex, listen, we are already 55 minutes in. I had a whole bunch of questions ready, to ask you, but time is running. Just because for sure the curiosity of people, they will ask me this question, so I'll ask you this question now. I know I'm going to see you at the Immersive Architecture event in Venice, which is the 1st and the 2nd of June. Any other events that you're going to be at, so that if people are watching this can meet you in person?
Yeah, that's a great question. June's going to be a really crazy busy month for me. I'm going over to the Immersive Architecture Conference for Venice. Really excited to meet a lot of people there who I've been following and admiring for the past 10 years. I'm going right from Venice over to London. So the Venice one is May 31st to June 2nd. June 3rd, I'm going to be in London for a conference called IDIAC, which is a big engineering and architecture conference that's specifically about theaters. And so I'll be showing a lot of cool VR stuff there. That's June 3rd to 5th. June 7th to 10th, I think I'm going to be at the World VR Forum in Switzerland. And then June 12th to 14th, I think I'll be back in London for VR AR World. And then June 18th to 20th, I'll be speaking at Autodesk University in London. And then I think I might actually head over to Manchester as well from June 22nd to June 21st to June 22nd for the Augmented and Virtual Reality Conference at Manchester Metropolitan University, because I've got a couple connections there. So I'll be mostly in London, but bouncing around Europe a little bit in June. And I love this stuff passionately, and I'm always excited to meet up and grab a coffee with someone who wants to talk about it.
Listen, now you're getting me very curious. Can I ask you, without giving away too much, what's your lecture in Venice going to be like, about? Sorry.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I've got some stuff that's under NDA right now that I'm hoping I'll be able to talk about at that point. But we'll assume we'll say I won't be able to talk about it, and then if I can, it'll just be a nice surprise. I'll probably be talking a little bit about the early days of virtual reality and how all these early principles that come from game design and these different things have fed into everything I'm doing now with virtual reality and architecture, and then also showing very specific case studies of here's a problem that this firm or this building or this developer was having that they thought either was going to be very expensive to solve or was going to take an enormous amount of time to solve, and here's the ways virtual reality was able to make that happen much faster. Similarly, because I just love showing what it's like to draw in virtual reality, I'm going to be giving some demos of that and then also talking about that a little bit in my presentation, just all the ways that with a few well-placed lines in VR, you can help to tell the story of a design.
One more question. What would you recommend in terms of gear and in terms of learning in order to get started in VR?
Yeah, great question. So the wonderful thing about the age we live in now is there's so many resources, maybe overwhelmingly so, but Unreal Engine and Unity both have fantastic tutorials to get you started for learning JavaScript, C# code if you want to get into that, which is more on the Unity side. I actually just went through some free courses at Code Academy. For anyone who's trying to build their very first VR experience, I actually did a course with Udemy, which can be found. I think it's usually on sale for like $10. So that's like a full 6 hours of like taking you through your first couple experiences. But yeah, I mean, you know, I think about when I learned Revit, okay, and I taught myself Revit in school when no one else was looking at it, and I saw the writing on the wall that it was going to be the future, but I was really intimidated by it at first. And the way I taught it to myself was by picking a building that I was really in love with, and I decided to just try to model it in Revit. So then I had the drive of trying to make that thing happen. Another example of that is when I learned guitar. I have a very talented musical family. My dad was in a rock band for 30 years and toured with the Guess Who and Aerosmith and all these cool guys.
Really?
I have a brother who, yeah, that's another story. And I have a brother who can play every instrument in the universe. And I decided at a pretty young age, like, oh, I just can't play instruments. That's too bad. But then I had a friend in high school who I really wanted to impress, who was like, hey, why don't you get a guitar and we'll start a band? And I was like, okay. So I got a guitar. And for the first time, I found myself learning chords and melodies that I wanted to learn. It wasn't scales or the stuff I was being told in music class. And it was like, oh, I really like this. And this is really a long-winded way of saying that, you know, if a tutorial looks boring or if something looks like it's just homework, don't do that, especially to start. Find the things that you're excited about. Find the paths that are going to take you to something that you're really thrilled by. And coding, just to use another instrument analogy too, is not as intimidating as people think it is. Like, it's kind of like learning a guitar, because my dad told me when I was starting to take more interest in guitar, he's like, you know what, you can learn like 4 chords. And with those 4 chords, you can play 80% of the songs you hear on the radio. And I was like, there's no way that's true. And I learned 4 chords, and he showed me like all the different songs I could play. And I was like, that's amazing. And coding is similar. You can learn like a few basic principles of code and do an enormous number of things with them. I remember the first time I learned how to, with code, turn objects on and off, like in a sequence. And so I could show like architectural design options, for example. And that's still like a pretty simple snippet of code that I use in most of my projects. So things like that you can get a lot of mileage out of. If people aren't familiar with the 80-20 rule, look that up.
I was about to say the Pareto effect. I made a video about this.
Excellent. Everyone check out Fabio's video on that. And yeah, it's an exciting industry because it's moving so fast, and I know people can be intimidated by that, but just find something about it that you're really excited about, that you love, and just dive in and try things, and don't be afraid to break stuff, and don't be afraid to leave things unfinished. You can get a project 60 or 70% of the way there and be like, okay, I learned something from this, and then keep going. That would happen sometimes.
That's a very good tip.
Yeah, you don't have to finish it. Same thing with like books and movies and everything. Like, if you're not digging a book after the first 100 pages, don't feel like you need to keep reading it. It's okay to move on to something else and not feel guilty about it. But yeah, like with the hackathon things, that's been an interesting balance for me, for example, because I've had games that, were really in a nice place by the end, and then I've studied them afterwards. I had people on my team who were better coders or 3D modelers or texture artists than I was, and I went back through the game and like studied, okay, how did they do this? Oh, that's totally different from how I would have done it, and you learn a lot that way. Similarly, I've had games that were just totally a mess by the end of 48 or 72 hours, and I kind of feel like, okay, I learned something from that, but I never need to look at it again. So, use your time well, find what excites you, and go with that.
Alex, one more thing, and I have to ask you this as a favor. At the end of the video, when I'm going to make it public, because it has to transcode and everything, can you give me all the links of the stuff that you talked, including your Udemy course, all the events that you're going to be at? Because people are asking, so it would be nice to have that comment, and I'll pin it to the video so that people can also find your YouTube channel, and give me as much information as possible, and I'll make sure that it will be visible. And that's it, man. We're already 1 hour and 3 minutes in. I would say, it's enough, because I see that slowly people are starting to die on us. It's okay, not everybody has 1 hour to spare. I just wanna, thank you very much for taking the time. To me, these were great insights. The talk was very inspirational also for people that want to learn, myself included. You know, you make it look so positive and so good in a way. And I really look forward to meeting you in Venice. I'm gonna stop the streaming right now. Don't go anywhere. I'll say goodbye to you. Guys, thanks a lot for watching. As always, if this is the first time that you're tuning in, Alex is already saying goodbye.
Bye.
If this is the first time that you're tuning in, feel free to like and share this video. Subscribe if you haven't done it already. I will see you hopefully next week, or maybe I'm doing another live tomorrow. I don't remember. My schedule is so busy. Alex, I'm gonna stop the recording. Thanks a lot for doing this. Don't go anywhere. Guys, see you soon.